The herald's voice carried without effort across the obsidian court. The sovereignty requires a guarantor from the human colonies, one individual of significant standing, delivered within 30 rotations, or all transit corridors through Vethori space close permanently. Colonial Liaison Preth, a small Mervathi with stress-colored scales, leaned toward the human standing beside her. "They mean a hostage," she whispered, dressed in diplomatic language, but a hostage. The human, Director Cassian Yol of the Colonial Trade Bureau, did not reply. He was watching the Emperor. Emperor Draeven Sohl sat at the head of the chamber on a seat that was less a throne and more an elevated platform, a subtle difference that meant he could pace, which he did. He was large even for a Vethori, nearly 3 meters of pale silver plating and controlled movement, and his eyes were the specific amber color that court observers had learned to read as impatient. "You have a daughter," the Emperor said, and the words were addressed not to Yol, but to the empty air beside him, as if speaking to the record itself. "Marcus Vael, your top negotiator, single parent. His daughter is 16 cycles, enrolled in Crestfall Academy on Colony 7. Her name is Petra." Yoli's jaw tightened. This was not a spontaneous declaration. This had been prepared. The sovereignty had done their research, and they were letting the humans know it. "The Director of Colonial Trade will return to your colonies," the Emperor continued, "and he will send us Marcus Vael. Vael will be given the rank of Human Trade Envoy, and his daughter will reside here as our honored guest until the new trade compact is finalized. We estimate 2 planetary years." The word honored fell into the room like a stone into still water. Preth's scales went from stress yellow to a sick pale green. 2 years, Yol finally spoke. "Your Imperial Majesty, this arrangement is not a negotiation." Draeven Sohl stopped pacing. "It is a condition. Your colonies depend on our corridors. Without transit access, your outer settlements starve in 8 months. You know this. We know this." He looked at Yol now, directly, and the amber eyes were very calm. "Send Vael. His daughter will be comfortable, and your colonies will continue to eat." Yol left the chamber with the treaty framework tucked under one arm and the taste of something cold in the back of his throat. He had 4 days to reach Colony 7 and tell Marcus Vael what the most powerful sovereign in the known spiral had just decided about his family. Marcus Vael was in the middle of an argument about grain pricing when Yol's shuttle touched down on the colony pad. Not a metaphorical argument. A literal one conducted at a long table in the trade hall with 7 agricultural delegates from the outer rings, 3 of whom had been shouting for the past 40 minutes about moisture tariffs. Marcus was not shouting. He was writing figures on a display board with patient, careful strokes, building a breakdown of the actual cost structure 1 line at a time, and the delegates were watching him do it because something about the precision of it made them feel embarrassed to keep yelling. He was 44, not particularly tall, with the kind of face that had been weathered by a decade of off-world travel and one very significant personal loss. The kind of loss that changes your center of gravity permanently but does not make you fragile. His hair had gone mostly gray in the past 3 years. He noticed Yole enter through the side door and raised 1 finger, a gesture that meant 5 more minutes. He finished the breakdown. He answered 2 questions. He scheduled a follow-up. Then he stepped out into the corridor and heard what Yol had to say, and for a long time he said nothing. Petra, he said finally. They know everything about her. The school, her schedule. I understand what that means. Marcus folded the data chip Yola handed him and placed it in his coat pocket without looking at it. They want me to feel that they can reach her if I don't cooperate. Marcus. They also want a skilled negotiator who is highly motivated to succeed. If the compact falls apart, so does my daughter's situation. He thought about this for a moment. His face was doing something that was not quite any single emotion. That's actually quite clever. Yoli stared at him. I've just told you that an alien emperor wants to use your daughter as leverage, and your response is that it's clever? The two aren't mutually exclusive. Marcus looked down the corridor. The moisture tariff delegates were filtering out of the trade hall, talking among themselves, calmer now than they'd been 2 hours ago. Who else are they considering for this assignment? You're the only one they asked for by name. Right. He straightened his coat. I'll need 2 weeks to brief my replacement on the Colony 7 accounts and arrange Petra's transfer from Crestfall. The Academy will need a proper handover, not a rushed one. She'll want to take her instruments. He paused. She plays 3. They're bulky. I'll need to negotiate cargo allocation in the transport. Yol opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. You're going to do this. I'm going to do this correctly, Marcus said. There's a difference. He told Petra himself. He drove out to Crestfall Academy the next morning, sat across from her in a small meeting room that smelled of chalk dust and cheap coffee, and explained the situation with full accuracy and no embellishment. She was 16, and she was her mother's daughter in the best possible ways. Direct, precise, and constitutionally allergic to being managed. She listened to everything he said without interrupting, which was more than most of his adult colleagues managed. So I'd be living at the Vethori Imperial Court, she said when he finished, in the diplomatic residential section, which is not a prison, but also not optional. She looked out the window at the practice yard. A group of younger students was running drills. For how long? 2 years, possibly less if negotiations go well. Are they going to go well? He considered this honestly. I intend to make them go well. She looked at him for a long moment. Dad, am I actually in danger? The Emperor wants a functional compact, he said. You being comfortable and unharmed serves that goal. So in the short term, no. In the longer term, it depends on how the negotiations develop. He leaned forward slightly, which is why I'm going. And why I intend to be very, very good at my job. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Can I bring the cello? I already filed the cargo request. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, more like the recognition that her father had already thought about the cello, which meant he had already committed to the plan, which meant he was genuinely confident. She trusted his read more than her own fear. Okay, she said. Tell me what I need to know about Vethori court etiquette. He pulled out his notes. They spent 4 hours going over protocol. The Vethori homeworld was called Soren Vast, which translated roughly as the place where the sky is owed to us, and the capital city was built in a basin between 2 volcanic ridges with architecture that favored height above everything. Buildings were tall and narrow. Walkways were at altitude. The imperial complex sat at the center of the basin, like a pivot around which everything else orbited, all pale stone and sharp angles with windows that reflected the reddish light of the local star. Marcus arrived with 4 boxes, a cello case, and no assistant. The last part had been deliberate. Bringing support staff would signal uncertainty. Coming alone signaled that he expected to be sufficient, which was the impression he wanted to set before the first meeting. The docking officer, a young Vethori whose plating was still the brighter silver of youth, looked at the manifest, and then at Marcus, and then at the cello case with visible confusion. "The instrument is declared under diplomatic personal effects," Marcus said calmly. "It is for my daughter's continued education. I trust the residential wing has a suitable room with enough floor space." "The human residential wing does not typically—" "Then we may need to select a different room," Marcus said. "I am happy to review the available options with whoever handles residential allocation." The officer was not being argued with exactly. He was being given a workable path forward and gently invited to find the right person. He sent a message on his communicator and, after a short wait, directed Marcus to follow a lower-ranked functionary toward the diplomatic complex. Petra was already there. She had arrived 2 days earlier by a separate transport, as required by the Emperor's terms, and she was standing in the corridor outside their assigned quarters with the controlled expression of someone who had spent 48 hours learning how to stand without showing anxiety in a place full of beings much larger than herself. She saw her father, and the expression cracked slightly, just at the edges. He didn't make a production of it. He just walked up, put a hand briefly on her shoulder, and said, "You look like you've been practicing." "The bowing thing is complicated," she said. "There are 4 different depths, and they mean different things." "Show me later. How's the room?" "Large. Cold. The window looks out at another building." She glanced at the cello case in his hand. "You actually brought it?" "I said I would." She took the case from him, and some of the tension went out of her back. The first formal meeting with Emperor Draeven Sohl occurred 3 days after Marcus's arrival, in a chamber called the Weighing Room, which was where the Vethori conducted all negotiations of consequence. The name was not metaphorical. There was an actual scale in the room, a massive mechanical device of bone-pale metal that had not been used for its original commodity-weighing purpose in several centuries, but remained as a reminder of what negotiations were actually about. Tesaveth, the Emperor's principal trade assessor, conducted the preliminary session. She was Vethori, but older than most of the court, her plating gone from silver to a muted pewter, and she had the particular economy of movement that came from having sat through 1,000 negotiations and developed a precise sense of what mattered and what didn't. She opened with the standard offer: favorable tariff rates in exchange for human colony loyalty pledges and a 10-year exclusivity clause on human-developed medical compounds. Marcus listened to all of it. He had a notepad. He took notes by hand, which was unusual enough in an age of recording devices that Tesaveth paused once to observe this. "I find it helps me retain the texture of offers," he said, "the rhythm of what's being asked versus what's being given. Recording captures words. Notes capture intent." Tesaveth regarded him. "You believe you can determine intent from handwriting speed." "I believe I can determine which points in a proposal the presenter considers most important by how long they spend on them, and which ones are placeholder language." He looked down at his notes. "The exclusivity clause, for example. You spent about 40% more time on the framing of that than on any other single provision." A pause. long enough to be informative. The exclusivity clause is a priority, Tessaveth said, which was not quite a confirmation, but was also not a denial. I appreciate the clarity. He made a note. We'll want to discuss the definition of medical compounds before agreeing to that language. The current framing is broad enough to include food processing agents, which affects a different set of colonial interests. Tessaveth made her own note. The session continued for 3 hours, and at the end of it, Marcus had not agreed to anything and had not refused anything, but both parties had a substantially clearer picture of where the real disagreements were. That was, as far as Marcus was concerned, a good first session. On his way out, a tall young court functionary with the bright plating of someone not yet 30 cycles stepped into his path, not aggressively, but with the deliberate positioning of someone who wanted to be noticed. "Human envoy," the functionary said. "High Warden Gratholin asks me to convey that your daughter was observed in the Eastern Practice Courts this morning, speaking with Vethori military cadets." Marcus stopped. He looked at the functionary with an expression of polite inquiry. "Speaking with or being spoken to without seeking the interaction?" The functionary hesitated. The warden did not specify. "Please ask him to specify and to let me know the answer." Marcus smiled pleasantly. "I am sure it is simply a misunderstanding. My daughter is curious about other cultures, which is a trait I encourage. If High Warden Olin would prefer she restrict her movements, I would appreciate formal written guidance on where the residential guests are and are not permitted to go. That way, we can avoid future confusion." The functionary left. Marcus continued walking, but something in his chest had gone cold and specific. Gratholin. He had read the briefing documents carefully. The High Warden oversaw imperial security and had opposed the trade negotiations on grounds that human colonies were more valuable as tributary states than as trading partners. He had also, the documents noted, served as the Emperor's primary advisor on strategic leverage. Marcus did not let himself think about that phrase for the rest of the walk back to the residential wing. He found Petra in the common room of their quarters, seated on the floor with an unfurled technical diagram that appeared to be a schematic for something in the residential building's life support system. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "The maintenance channel is open and unencrypted," she said without looking up. "I got bored and started reading the building specs." "Dad, the humidity regulation in this wing is completely wrong for human biology. We're losing approximately 12% of our respiratory efficiency because the system is calibrated for Vethori lung structure." He looked at the diagram. "How long have you known this?" "Since day 2. I've been compensating by drinking more water, but it's not optimal." She tapped the diagram. "There's a secondary calibration panel on sublevel 3. It would take about 2 hours to reprogram." I drew a map. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you speak with military cadets this morning?" She looked up. "2 of them were training near the practice court when I went out for a run. They asked me what I was doing. I told them I was running for cardiovascular exercise and explained the concept since they seemed unfamiliar with purely physical conditioning routines. We talked for about 10 minutes. Is that a problem?" "It became one in someone else's hands," he said. High Warden Olin noticed. He sent someone to tell me about it. Petra was quiet. She understood what he was not quite saying. that the High Warden was watching them and looking for reasons to present her presence here as disruptive or threatening. She folded the diagram carefully. Should I stop running outside? No. He sat down in the chair nearest to her. But I want you to start keeping a brief daily log of your interactions with anyone in the court. Nothing elaborate, just who, when, what the topic was, and your assessment of their interest. In your own words. She nodded slowly. You're treating this like a diplomatic post. It is a diplomatic post. You're not a hostage. He said this with enough quietness that it landed as fact rather than reassurance. You're here because the Emperor wanted leverage over me, but the way you conduct yourself here will matter to how people remember humans. You're 17 people out of 100 billion, and every one of you who sets foot in Vethori space is building a picture in their minds of what humans are. She was quiet for a while. That's a lot of pressure. It is, and I'm going to help you carry it, but I am not going to pretend it isn't there. She looked at the folded diagram. Can I still fix the humidity system? Let me approach the residential facility manager through official channels first. I'll credit the finding to you. That's not necessary. It is necessary. You found a real problem that affects our health. That earns credit. Taking it for you would be doing you a disservice. She thought about that. Then she nodded. The humidity issue turned out to be more useful than expected. Marcus raised it formally in a session with the Facility Management Office, presenting Petra's analysis with full attribution. The residential coordinator, a middle-aged Vethori named Oveth, who had spent his career ensuring that the diplomatic residential wing ran smoothly and received approximately zero acknowledgement for it, looked at the analysis with an expression of someone who had just been handed a gift they weren't sure they were allowed to accept. The recalibration has been on our pending list for 3 cycles, Oveth said carefully. There are no humans currently assigned to us, so it has not been prioritized. There are now, Marcus said, and the fix seems straightforward. My daughter has already identified the access panel. I would simply ask that the work be completed at your team's earliest convenience. Oveth recalibrated the system himself within the day. He also, without being asked, provided Marcus with a map of all available recreational spaces in the diplomatic complex along with their current occupancy schedules, which neatly solved the question of where Petra was allowed to go, since now Marcus had an official document, rather than needing to wait for Olin to respond. Olin, notably, never did respond. 3 weeks into negotiations, High Warden Groth Olin made his first direct move. It happened in a plenary session that included both Tessaveth and 3 senior trade ministers from the outer Vethori provinces. These ministers controlled transit corridors through their own territorial sections, which meant they had negotiating weight, independent of the Emperor's direct authority. Marcus had spent the previous week building careful, separate working relationships with 2 of them, a process that involved a great deal of listening and very little talking on his part. Olin was not supposed to be in the session. He arrived anyway, standing at the edge of the chamber in full security dress with 3 of his officers, which was a statement in itself. He waited for a natural pause in the proceedings, then said, "The envoy has been conducting private meetings with provincial ministers without notifying the Emperor's trade office of the subjects discussed." Every head in the room turned toward Marcus. Marcus set down his notes. He did not stand. "That is true," he said. I have met separately with Minister Drovar and Minister Yesel to discuss the provincial transit infrastructure needs that relate directly to the human colony supply chains. These are working sessions, not negotiations, and they were not required under the compact framework to be reported to the Trade Office until they produced a formal proposal. He looked at Olin. Has there been a change to the reporting requirements? The Trade Office expects to be informed. Of formal proposals and agreements, yes. The existing protocol is quite clear on that. Marcus allowed the mildest possible version of confusion to enter his voice. If you are suggesting the protocol should be updated, I would welcome that discussion. Perhaps Assessor Tessaveth could convene a working group? Tessaveth, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone cataloging information rather than taking a side, said dryly, "I will add it to the schedule." Olin's plating did something Marcus had learned to read as the Vethori equivalent of clenched teeth. The warden's office has concerns about the scope of topics being discussed in private. Then send an observer, Marcus said. He smiled at Olin with perfect professional warmth. I have nothing to conceal and would welcome the additional context. It was not a concession. It was a trap, and Olin knew it, because if he sent an observer, he was implicitly acknowledging that private working sessions were acceptable, which undermined his own objection. And if he didn't, he had no grounds to complain about them. Olin withdrew from the session. The three ministers exchanged glances that Marcus could not fully interpret, but read as roughly amused. Minister Drovar, the eldest of the three, and a Vethori who had spent 60 years negotiating internal provincial boundaries, leaned slightly toward Marcus after the session concluded, and said in a tone that was not quite approval but was close to it, "You did not lose your composure." The warden raised a legitimate procedural question, Marcus said. It deserved a legitimate procedural answer. He was trying to embarrass you in front of witnesses. I know, Marcus collected his notes. But responding to what he was trying to do would have required me to assume bad faith in public, which would have made me look defensive. Responding to what he actually said required only that I know the protocols. He paused. Which I do. Drovar made a sound that was probably a laugh, though Vethori respiratory humor was difficult to parse. The human colonies sent a careful one. Petra's first serious crisis came in the 8th week. She had been spending supervised time in the Imperial Archive, a research resource available to diplomatic guests, working on a project she had designed herself. A comparative study of Vethori and human music structure. She had gotten permission from 3 separate officials to use the archive's instrument collection to record brief demonstrations and was making progress that she reported to Marcus in careful daily logs. Then one of her recordings went public, not through any action of hers. The archive's public access node had a misconfigured permission setting, and 3 minutes of Petra playing a Vethori ceremonial piece on her cello, a piece she had learned specifically because she respected the culture she was living in, ended up distributed across the Imperial Information Network. The piece she had played was traditionally performed only by Vethori adults of specific standing during a ceremony of mourning. She hadn't known that. The archive staff member who had given her access hadn't mentioned it, either through oversight or assumption. By morning, it was a diplomatic incident. Marcus read the first complaint when he woke up. He read the second before he had finished reading the first. He went to Petra's room, knocked, and when she opened the door, she was already holding her own copy of the notifications, her face very still. "I didn't know," she said. "I know." He stepped inside. "Tell me exactly what you knew and when." She walked him through everything: the permissions she had obtained, the staff member who had approved the access, the choice of piece and why she'd chosen it, the recording she'd made and what she'd intended it for. She was precise and complete and did not make a single excuse. He nodded when she was done. "Here is what we are going to do. First, you are going to write a formal acknowledgement of the error and a direct apology to the keeper of the archive and to the ceremonial office. Not to anyone else yet. Direct and specific, not broad. State exactly what happened, what you didn't know, and why you believe it was important to understand the piece." "Should I offer to retract it from the network?" "The network doesn't work that way, and everyone knows it. Offering to do the impossible signals that you don't understand the situation. Instead, offer something you can actually do." "What can you actually do?" She thought. "I could document the error in the archive's access protocols. Write a formal flag that ceremonial pieces need to be labeled for restrictions, so it doesn't happen to anyone else." He looked at her. "That is a very good answer." "It doesn't fix the offense." "No, but it turns the mistake into something that has a lasting, useful outcome. That matters." He moved toward the door. "Write the letters. I will reach out to Tessaveth to let the trade office know what happened before Olin can present his version of it. Then we will see what the response is." The letters Petra wrote were, in Marcus's estimation, exactly right. Direct, specific, no performative distress, no deflection. She included a proposal about access labeling in the second one. The keeper of the archive responded within 3 hours. He was not pleased, but he was also, as it emerged in a meeting that afternoon, genuinely interested in the labeling proposal, which the archive had needed for decades and had never implemented due to bureaucratic inertia. He had opinions about how it should be structured. He and Petra spent 2 hours in a supervised working session at the archive discussing implementation, and by the end of it, the keeper had stopped being not pleased and had become something more like professionally engaged. Grath Olin filed a formal complaint with the Emperor's Protocol Office about the recording incident. The Protocol Office reviewed the archive permissions documentation and determined that the error originated with the misconfigured access node, not with the diplomat's daughter, and marked it as resolved. The labeling protocol was implemented 6 weeks later. It was credited to both Petra Vael and the Keeper's Office jointly. What Marcus was building during these months was not visible on the surface. The formal negotiations produced steady incremental progress. The exclusivity clause language was narrowed. The tariff framework took shape. The provincial ministers became active participants rather than observers. But underneath that, something else was developing. The provincial ministers had their own grievances with the Emperor's trade office. Drovar's territory had been waiting for 12 years for a renegotiation of internal transit fees that the office kept deferring. Yesel's province had 3 human-style medical facilities that served a mixed population and needed supply chain regularization that the compact, as currently structured, did not address. A third minister, Rethis, had a territorial dispute with an adjacent Vethori province that was not Marcus's problem, but that she had mentioned 3 times in passing, which meant it was weighing on her. Marcus listened to all of this. He asked careful questions. He took notes. He did not promise anything, but he began, in quiet side conversations over working sessions, to suggest frameworks. He introduced Drovar to a human logistics specialist who worked in transit infrastructure. He mentioned to Yesel that the medical facility supply issue was almost certainly solvable through existing compact language, with a minor interpretive clarification. He asked Rethys what a fair resolution of her territorial dispute would look like to her, and then he asked who, on the other side of the dispute, she thought had the most to gain from a settlement. This was not altruism. It was a very long-term calculation. Human colonies depended on Vethori transit corridors. Those corridors ran through provincial territories. If Marcus could make himself useful to the provincial ministers without overstepping his actual mandate, then when the compact came before the full council for ratification, there would be 3 powerful voices in the room who had specific reasons to want it to succeed. The calculation was also visible enough that Tesiveth noticed it. "You're building a constituency," she said to him in one of their late sessions, when the formal agenda had been exhausted and they were both reviewing annotated versions of the same tariff schedule. "I am trying to ensure that the compact is useful to everyone who has to live under it," Marcus said. "A compact that only serves the parties who signed it tends to create resentment among everyone who didn't. That resentment becomes the next decade's problems." "You are thinking 10 years forward. I'm thinking 20. He looked at his notes. "The Vethori sovereignty is the dominant force in this region. Human colonies need access to your space to survive. That power imbalance isn't going away. But imbalanced relationships can still be functional if the less powerful party has real and useful things to contribute." He paused. "I would prefer a functional relationship over a resentful one. I suspect the Emperor would as well, though he might express it differently." Tesiveth was quiet for a moment. "The High Warden believes you are building a political base to use against the Emperor." "The High Warden may believe whatever he chooses," Marcus said. "What I am doing is documented in my session logs, all of which are available to the Trade Office per protocol." Another pause. Longer this time. "I know," Tesiveth said, and something in her tone had shifted. Less assessor, more individual. "I have read all of them." The crisis came in the 4th month, and it was not the crisis Marcus had expected. Grath Olin had been patient, which Marcus had anticipated. What he had not anticipated was the nature of Olin's final move. The High Warden did not go through official channels. He went to the Emperor directly, in a private audience, and presented a case that the human envoy had exceeded his diplomatic mandate by conducting political outreach with provincial ministers in a manner that amounted to interference in internal Vethori governance. Marcus knew about the audience within an hour because Oveth, the residential coordinator, had noticed an unusual shift in the duty rosters and mentioned it to him. Marcus had by this point spent 4 months listening to Oveth talk about the rhythms of the complex's operations and had become, without specifically intending to, someone Oveth found it natural to mention things to. He thought carefully about what to do for approximately 15 minutes. Then he sent a formal request for an audience with Emperor Draeven Sohl. The request was granted the following morning. Sohl's personal reception chamber was smaller than the Obsidian Court, and deliberately informal by Vethori standards, which meant the ceiling was only 12 meters high instead of 30. The Emperor received Marcus standing, which was also informal. Marcus bowed at the second depth, which Petra's notes had described as respectful without deferential, appropriate for a peer relationship. Then he waited. "You requested this audience," Sohl said. "I did." Marcus did not make any preliminaries. "I understand that High Warden Olin has raised concerns about the scope of my activities during the negotiation period. I wanted to address those concerns directly with you rather than through intermediaries, because I believe you deserve a direct account." Sohl's amber eyes were steady. "Continue." "My mandate is to produce a functional trade compact between the human colonies and the Vethori sovereignty. To do that well, I needed to understand the concerns and interests of everyone who would be affected by the compact's terms. The provincial ministers have territorial interests that intersect with the colonial supply chains. I developed working relationships with them in service of that goal." He paused. "I also, over the course of those conversations, became aware of internal Vethori concerns that are not strictly within my mandate. I did not attempt to resolve those concerns. I suggested frameworks. The decisions were entirely theirs." Sohl was quiet for a moment. "Olin believes you are positioning yourself as a broker of provincial interests to create leverage." "I don't have leverage," Marcus said simply. "You have my daughter. You have 30 rotations worth of colonial transit dependency. I have knowledge, professional relationships, and a track record that can be reviewed. If I were trying to build leverage, I would be doing it very inefficiently." He allowed a fractional pause. "What I am trying to do is make the compact worth something in 20 years. Leverage expires. Useful relationships don't." The Emperor looked at him for a long time, long enough that Marcus had time to wonder if he had miscalculated. The room was very quiet. Outside, something that sounded like wind moved across the stone face of the building. "Olin wants me to expel you," Sohl said finally. "I know. He believes the provincial alliances you have been building represent a future threat to the sovereignty's unity." Marcus considered his next words very carefully. "A Vethori leader who requires provincial ministers to remain isolated from external relationships in order to maintain their loyalty has a different problem than the one the High Warden is describing. I don't think that's your situation." He met the amber eyes squarely. "But you know your court better than I do. If my presence here is genuinely destabilizing, I will accept that judgment. I would ask only that my daughter's situation be resolved appropriately, and that the colonial transit corridors not be closed in retaliation for something that was done in good faith." Another long silence. "You're prepared to leave," Sohl said, and it was not quite a question. "I'm prepared to deal with whatever outcome you decide. That's different from being prepared to leave." Marcus allowed himself a very small, very genuine tone of dryness. "I have 4 months of work invested in this compact. I would prefer to finish it." Something moved in Sohl's expression that Marcus had not seen there before. It was possible it was the Vethori equivalent of being surprised by something. "High Warden Olin is very good at identifying potential threats," the Emperor said slowly. "He has served me for 30 years on that basis. But he is," a pause, "not equally good at distinguishing between a threat and a relationship that does not fit his models." Marcus said nothing because this was not his territory, and he knew it. The compact will continue, Sohl said. Olin will be reassigned to the Eastern Security Division. This will be presented as a standard rotation. He looked at Marcus with the directness of someone who had made a calculation and was not interested in discussing it. I will expect the compact to be worth the investment. It will be, Marcus said. He bowed again at the second depth. Thank you for hearing me directly. He was most of the way back to the residential wing before he let himself exhale fully. The following 3 months were different. Not easier exactly. The compact negotiations went through several difficult passages. The medical compound language took weeks of careful drafting to get right, and the provincial transit integration required an entirely new supplemental agreement that nobody had anticipated. But the atmosphere changed. Olin's removal was noticed throughout the court, and what people appeared to take from it was that the Emperor had concluded the human envoy was worth taking seriously. That had effects on everything. Tessaveth became a genuine collaborator rather than an assessor. She had strong instincts about what the Emperor would and would not accept, and she began sharing those instincts directly, rather than leaving Marcus to infer them. Marcus, in turn, was more transparent with her about the colonial priorities that were actually fixed versus the ones that had room for adjustment. Their sessions became efficient in a different way, less tactical maneuvering, more problem-solving. Drovar, Yesel, and Rethis all formally joined the negotiating council when the provincial supplemental was added to the agenda. The addition of provincial representatives to what had been a bilateral negotiation complicated things in the short term and simplified them dramatically in the longer term because the ministers knew exactly what their territories needed and were prepared to negotiate for it directly. Petra, meanwhile, had become a quietly significant figure in the diplomatic residential wing, which neither she nor Marcus had planned. The archive labeling project had led to an ongoing working relationship with the Keeper's office. A Murvathi family in the residential complex had a small child who was struggling to adjust to the acoustic environment of the building, a problem Petra solved by identifying that the building's resonance frequencies conflicted with Murvathi auditory processing and suggesting acoustic paneling placements. She had no formal standing. She was a teenager who was good at listening and thinking. She filed daily logs. Marcus read every one. He also, in the 6th month, had a conversation with Sohl that was not formal and was not about the compact. He had been in the eastern garden of the complex, one of the rare green spaces, planted in a style that was meant to approximate several different world types, and succeeded at none of them, but was pleasant anyway. When the Emperor arrived on what appeared to be a private walk, both of them acknowledged this was probably not accidental, but neither said so. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing that would appear in any official record. The Emperor had questions about human settlement patterns, specifically why human colonies tended to develop distinctive local cultures so quickly. Marcus explained, in terms that were mostly accurate, that humans had a strong tendency to adapt available materials and aesthetics to local conditions, and that this was partially practical and partially something harder to define. Sohl said, with the directness Marcus had come to expect from him, "Your daughter is the same way. She arrived 4 months ago knowing nothing about this place, and she has become someone that 3 departments consider a useful colleague. My residential coordinator mentions her in reports more often than he mentions anyone else in the diplomatic wing." Marcus looked at the garden. She is her mother's daughter in that way, he said. Her mother was very good at making herself useful to the people around her. It was not strategic. It was just how she was built. Your daughter is not here by choice, Sohl said. No, Marcus said. I made that decision as a political calculation, Sohl said. It was not quite an apology, but it was something more than a statement. I understand why you made it, Marcus said. A negotiator who cannot be bought, but who has something to protect, is a useful kind of negotiator. It ensures that I am motivated to produce something real. He was quiet for a moment. It was also not a pleasant thing to do to a 16-year-old who had no part in any of this. Sohl was quiet for a long time. No, he said finally, it was not. They did not discuss it further, but something was established in that silence that had not been there before, and Marcus noted it. The compact was initialed in the 9th month and formally signed in the 10th. The signing ceremony was held in the Obsidian Court, which was full. The provincial ministers were present as signatories for the supplemental agreement, which was itself historic. Provincial ministers had not been party to a central compact since a territorial consolidation 80 years prior. Petra was in the observer gallery, which was where she had been asked to sit. She was wearing the same coat she had arrived in, and her hair was longer than it had been, and she was watching everything with the careful attention of someone who was making a memory. After the signing, as the formal session dissolved into the less formal reception that followed, Tessiveth made her way to Marcus in the way of someone who has something to say and is choosing the right moment. It is a good compact, she said. We produced it together, he said. She considered this. You produced a version of it that is better than what I would have made on my own, she said, with the precision of someone giving an accurate assessment. I would have secured the terms. You secured the relationships that will make the terms function. The terms needed the relationships, Marcus said, and the relationships needed terms that were worth protecting. Tessiveth was quiet for a moment. The High Warden, she said. He is not wrong that you changed things here. He was wrong about why, Marcus said. Yes. She looked out at the room. He has been in the Eastern Security Division for 3 months. The reports from there are that he is performing his duties with his characteristic diligence. A pause. He is not a bad person, High Warden Olin. He is a very good one at seeing threats. The difficulty is that his models are old. They may need updating, Marcus said. They may, Tessiveth said. I suspect he is in the process of doing that. The question of Petra's departure required one more conversation with the Emperor. This one was formal and brief, and Marcus approached it with care. The compact was signed. The political argument for holding a diplomat's teenage daughter in the imperial court had expired. But expiration was not release, and Marcus was not going to assume a favorable interpretation of silence. He requested the audience. He made his case, which was simple. The compact was signed, the terms had been met, and Petra's continued residency in the diplomatic wing served no purpose that the compact's success did not already address more effectively. Sohl said, "She may go when she chooses." A pause. Or she may remain in an official academic capacity if she wishes. The archive has made a formal inquiry about her availability. Marcus had not expected the second half of that sentence. He was quiet for a moment. I will tell her, he said. The decision is hers. Sohl looked at him. You are not going to encourage either option. I'm going to make sure she understands both of them accurately, Marcus said. What she does with accurate information is her business. Something in Sohl's expression settled. I will have the residential coordinator prepare departure documents for both of you in any case, he said. Whether you use them at the same time or separately is your arrangement. He sat down with Petra that evening in their quarters, in the chairs they had moved to face the window. Not a particularly impressive window, still looking out at another building. But the light at this hour was the reddish gold of the local star catching the pale stone, and it was actually quite striking. He told her about the archive offer. He told her about the departure option. He gave her accurate information about what both meant, including the parts that weren't comfortable, that staying would mean continued separation, that leaving now would mean abandoning a project that had become genuinely useful, and that neither choice had a clean emotional resolution. She was quiet for a long time. The reddish light moved slowly across the floor as they sat there. I want to go home, she said finally. I want to see my friends and sleep in my own bed and eat food that doesn't require me to research the ingredient list for anything that interacts badly with human kidneys. That's a very reasonable thing to want, Marcus said. But I also want to finish the labeling project properly. The Keeper's office has 3 more restricted collection categories that haven't been cataloged, and if I leave now, they'll probably just not get done. That is also possible. She looked at him. Is there a version where I go home for a few months and come back in a proper capacity? Not as a hostage, as someone who actually chose to be here. I think, Marcus said carefully, that given how the past 10 months have gone, that conversation would be received well. She nodded slowly. Okay. She looked back at the window. Dad, are we safe here now? Actually safe? He thought about this honestly. Safer than we were, not unconditionally. There are people in this court who are still adjusting to what happened, and Sohl is a sovereign leader who makes decisions based on interests, not sentiment, so I would never describe it as unconditional. He paused. But the High Warden has been reassigned, the compact is signed, and we have relationships with people across this court who have specific reasons to value what we provide. That's a different position than 10 months ago. You changed things, she said. We changed things, he said. Your archive project is cited in the Compact's supplemental materials as an example of collaborative cultural documentation. Drovar mentioned it in the signing session. She turned to look at him with an expression he recognized. His mother's expression when she had been handed information that updated her estimate of a situation. You're joking. I am not joking. Check the session record. She was quiet again, but differently quiet. The tension that had lived in her shoulders for 10 months had not entirely dissolved. It would probably take a few months at home for that to happen. But it had changed shape. It was the tension of someone thinking about the future rather than the tension of someone waiting for the next threat. I'll tell the Keeper I need to go home first, she said, and then I'll ask about a formal arrangement, a real one. That seems right, Marcus said. They left Soren Vast 17 days later on a carrier that was transporting the first shipment of human-produced medical compounds under the new Compact's terms. The irony of this was not lost on Marcus. He filed a note about it in his final session log. The departure was not a ceremony. Oveth was there at the docking bay to see them off, which was not in his job description. Tesiveth sent a written message, as she preferred to handle personal communication. Drovar and Yesel sent formal acknowledgments from their provincial offices. The archive keeper came in person and shook Petra's hand in the specific way she had learned meant serious professional respect among Vethori elders. The emperor was not there, which was appropriate. Emperors did not see off envoys at docking bays. But a formal note arrived with his seal addressed to Marcus that read, "The compact will hold. Return when it needs attention." It was not warm exactly, but it was direct and it was a commitment, and Marcus had learned to value those things. The colonial transit corridors reopened at full capacity within the month. The outer settlements that had been running rationed supply schedules for over a year, quietly, without making it a political crisis, returned to standard operation. The medical supply chain regularization affected 11 facilities across 3 provinces and human colonies simultaneously, which was not dramatic, but was the kind of thing that mattered to people who ran out of specific medications when supply chains failed. Minister Rethus settled her territorial dispute with the adjacent province 4 months after the signing. The framework she used drew on a model Marcus had mentioned in passing during one of their working sessions, adapted significantly by her own staff. She did not credit Marcus. She did not need to, and he would not have expected it. Grath Olin completed his rotation in the Eastern Security Division and returned to the court in an advisory role to a newly created Interdepartmental Council on External Relations. The council's structure had been designed partly based on observations about the compact negotiation. He and Marcus never met again, but Tesiveth mentioned, much later, that Olin had read the complete record of the compact negotiations and had requested access to Marcus's annotated session logs. Petra returned to Soren Vast 7 months after her first departure on a formal academic exchange arrangement between the Colonial Research Institute and the Imperial Archive. She was 18 by then, and the arrangement was entirely her choice, and she had negotiated the terms of it herself, with minimal input from Marcus beyond a review of the final draft. He had a few notes on the draft. She disagreed with 2 of them and was right about both. There is a version of this story that people tell in the outer colonies, where Marcus Vael went to the Vethori court alone and negotiated a great empire into a fair compact through cleverness and nerve. That version is simpler and has a cleaner shape. The version in the records is more complicated. It has humidity recalibration reports and archive access logs, and a teenager who learned 3 things about Vethori ceremonial music and made a mistake, and then fixed it so well that the mistake became a permanent improvement to the archive's protocols. It has a residential coordinator who noticed an unusual duty roster and mentioned it to someone he trusted. It has 2 provincial ministers who had been ignored for a decade and had very specific things they needed, and a negotiator who asked what those things were and then listened carefully to the answers. It also has a father who never forgot for a single day of those 10 months that his daughter was in a place she had not chosen, and who responded to that fact not by collapsing under it or raging against it, but by doing the work he had been sent to do with enough skill and consistency that by the end of it, the place she had not chosen had become a place that valued her presence. That is a harder thing to put in a story. It is also the thing that mattered. The compact was renewed without significant renegotiation 8 years after its signing. The record of the original sessions is taught in 3 Vethori provincial administrative academies as a case study in what bilateral negotiation looks like when both parties engage with the full range of interests involved. Marcus Vael is listed in the record as Human Trade Envoy. Petra Vael is listed as Contributing Scholar, Archive Labeling Protocols. Both of them, when asked about those 10 months, tend to give different answers. Marcus talks about the work. Petra talks about the window in their quarters and the way the reddish-gold light moved across the floor in the evenings, and how she learned to find something worth paying attention to, even in rooms she had not chosen, which is, in the end, a skill worth having. If this kind of story means something to you, built carefully rather than quickly, with characters who earn what they get, pass it along to someone who would appreciate it. That's how stories like this find the people they belong to